Okay, good morning, ladies and gentlemen. I'm Paul Johnson, I'm Director of the IFS, and all I'm going to do is to welcome you and to introduce today's event and speakers. As I'm sure you know, today we're going to be talking about the reforms to council tax support and its localisation. My colleagues Stuart Adam and Tom Pope will be speaking about that. Council tax support is massively underreported relative to a lot of the other benefit changes that are going on, particularly the move to universal credit. After all, it is the benefit to which more people are entitled at the moment than any other. And the reforms and localisation have been really very substantial, as you're going to hear, and have had big effects on people's incomes and differential effects according to where people live. They've also had significant effects on collection rates and on local authority finances. The way we're going to go is that Stuart will start by describing essentially what has happened, how different local authorities have changed what they've done and the effects that's had on household incomes, and then Tom will move on to look at how that's resulted in behaviour change, and particularly what's happened to payments and collection rates. I'd like to, before kicking off, thank the Nuffield Foundation, who have funded this particular research project, indeed alongside a number of other pieces of work that we do here at the IFS, and as ever the ESRC, where we have a research centre here, and indeed we are now one of only two research institutes funded by the ESRC, which underpins a lot of what we do. So I won't say any more. I will hand over to Stuart, who will kick off with the main analysis. Thank you.
Thanks, Paul. Can I also thank the Nuffield Foundation for funding the research. Thanks to Citizens Advice, Untitled Chapter and NPI for providing some of the data that we're using for our analysis today, and also thank the advisory group who helped us throughout the course of our project and provided feedback. Needless to say, none of our views and no doubt mistakes are theirs. I suspect you will all know this. What is council tax support? Means-tested reduction in household council tax bill claimed by nearly 5 million households across Britain. That's more than any other means-tested payment, at a cost to local authorities of about £4 billion. That's reducing their council tax revenue by 11%, leaving them with £33 billion of net revenue. Now, of that, £1.5 billion went to working age claimants in England, applying an average award of £770 a year. And those are going to be the main focus of our presentation today and the report that we're launching. And the reason for that is because of the key context for our report, which was the major reform that happened in 2013, when the national system of council tax benefit was replaced with a local system of council tax support. So all 326 local authorities, strictly billing authorities in England, and the Scottish and Welsh governments became responsible for designing, not just administering, council tax support for working age claimants. Entitlement for pension has continued to be set nationally and has largely been protected. When this was localised, central government gave local authorities a grant to pay for the cost of council tax support, but the amount of funding it gave them was only 90% of what council tax benefit would have cost that year if it had remained intact. And of course, given the need to protect pensioners, that was equivalent to a cut much bigger than 10%, nearer 20%, of the cost of council tax benefit for those of working age. And the Scottish and Welsh governments largely decided to protect the scheme as it was, and have made very few changes since then. They didn't localise it to local authorities within Scotland and Wales. And so our research is going to focus, on working age households in England whose entitlements now vary according to which local authority they live in. And so what questions are we trying to answer with the research that we're launching today? Well, first of all, we want to summarise how council tax support has changed since it was localised and what that's done to households' entitlements, their incomes and local authority revenues as a result. Look at what kinds of local authorities chose what kinds of scheme. So I'm going to cover those, and then I'll hand over to Tom, who will look at how households have been affected to and then reacted to, affected by and then reacted to these changes. So broadly speaking, I'm going to cover what is in chapters 1 to 3 of the full report. Tom will cover chapters 4 to 6. One thing that we're not going to say much about is universal credit, which is not only an important benefit reform going on in its own right, but also is beginning to have important implications for council tax support. That's now actually less important during the period we're looking at, during the period of the last 5 years, than it's going to be going forward. And we do intend to look at this in future research, so watch this space, but I'm not going to say much more about it now. So, to understand changes to council tax support that have happened, we first of all need to understand what the system was that they were changing. So this is just going to show an example for someone, for a family, a household, and look at what happens at different levels of income. So, just for illustration, I've picked a household with a council tax liability of £1,000 a year. Now, if they have little or no other sources of income, their council tax benefit would have covered their council tax bill in full, leaving them with nothing they would need to pay themselves. Once their income exceeded a level of needs that was assessed by central government, and roughly speaking that's the level below which you would be entitled to something like income support or job seekers allowance anyway, in which case you would automatically get full council tax benefit. Once your income exceeded that, your council tax benefit was reduced by 20p for each pound of income above those assessed needs until it ran out. And so, to give a sense of scale, around half of entitled households would be entitled to have their council tax bill covered in full, and about half would be entitled to have it partially covered, though the take-up rate among those entitled to less was lower. So actually more than half of the claimants are entitled to full council tax benefit. And because, of course, these people are entitled to more than these people, considerably more than half of the costs went to those people who are having their council tax covered in full. And in terms of what kinds of people we're talking about here, a bit under half of them were pensioners, and of those of working age, around a third were lone parents, around a third long-term sick or disabled, about 16%, I think it was, were classified as unemployed. So, how have local authorities changed these schemes? I'm going to start with one thing that has been barely noticed at all, which is that central government has been making lots of changes to national benefits, most importantly the freeze to many working age benefit rates that's been in place since 2015, but also some other changes like restricting additional support to the first 2 children in a family, some of which have been quite controversial, and many local authorities have mirrored those changes to national benefits in their council tax support schemes. So to give an example of what this would mean, it doesn't change the maximum amount of council tax benefit or council tax support, as it's now become, you can get, but it does reduce the income that you can get before that support starts to be withdrawn. And so this can be a significant cut in support for low-income working families in particular. Now, to some extent, because these were just mirroring changes that were being made to the national benefit system. These are things that you might have expected to happen to council tax benefit even if it had stayed centralised. But when it was localised, local authorities weren't obliged to do the same thing as central government was doing and to follow those changes, but many of them have. However, now 90% of local authorities have made other changes as well as that. The most important of those that about 80% of local authorities have done is to introduce a minimum payment of council tax. And what that basically means, so a typical example would be if your council tax bill was £1,000 and your local authority said there's a minimum payment of 20% of your council tax, that would mean that everyone has to pay at least that £200. So maximum support would be down to £800, and then everyone sees their support reduced accordingly. And so an important implication of this is that many of those on the lowest incomes who previously wouldn't have had any council tax to pay now do. And this is the first time that we've seen many low-income households having to pay local tax since the poll tax was abolished. There have been a number of other changes that I'm going to say very little about, like changing how quickly income is withdrawn once, how quickly support is withdrawn once your income exceeds a threshold, how much savings you can have before that eliminates your support, and so on. And local authorities making any of these changes are more likely to have made others as well. Now, while lots of local authorities, well, almost all local authorities were making cuts of some sort, a sizable minority designated certain groups as being vulnerable and therefore protected from some or all of the changes that they were making, and even more had discretionary funds to help people with hardship. Now, I'm not going to say much more about these, partly because by their very nature of being discretionary, we can't really analyse the rules that applied and who got how much as a result of these discretionary funds, but we should acknowledge that they do exist to help some of those who would otherwise fall through the cracks. So, having got data from Entitled to an NPI on how local authorities have changed their council tax support schemes, we can then run those through our tax and benefit microsimulation model and apply them to many thousands of households, about 20,000 households a year, who fill in surveys giving with the characteristics of their household. We can calculate how much each one would be entitled to with and without the reforms, and therefore how much they lost. Now, doing that across the whole population, scaling up to a UK-wide figure, we see that entitlements were cut by about £400 million when the reforms were first introduced in 2013-14. That's a cut of about 14% in entitlements. But the cuts have continued to get bigger ever since. In fact, about a 70% increase. And the cuts now, council tax support, is about 24% less generous than it would have been if the old council tax benefit system had been kept and its generosity maintained. And we can separate out the part of that that is local authorities just mirroring changes to national benefits that we think may have happened even if local authorities hadn't been responsible for it. If we take those out, there's still a 20% cut in entitlements, so about half of the additional cuts since 2013-14 have come from mirroring these changes to national benefits. And as we can see, minimum payments account for the large majority of the remaining cuts that local authorities have made, about 85% of the part that isn't just mirroring national benefit cuts. So let's take a closer look at the minimum payments that local authorities have introduced. Well, not all of them have. I say about 70 or so local authorities still don't have any minimum payment. That's just over 1 in 5. By far the most common choice now is a minimum payment of 20% that almost a quarter of local authorities have, but about a fifth of local authorities have minimum payments of more than 20%. For the most part, they are bunched at round numbers, 15%, 20%, 25%. In some ways, the oddity here is that the second most popular level of minimum payments for local authorities to choose is 8.5%, a apparently strange and arbitrary sounding number. The reason for this goes back to the first year that localisation happened, when central government gave an additional one-off grant for 1 year only for local authorities whose council tax support schemes met certain criteria, the main one being having a minimum payment of no more than 8.5%. As a result of that, 100 local authorities chose minimum payments of exactly 8.5%. What's interesting is that 5 years after that incentive expired, 38 local authorities still have a minimum payment of 8.5%. That suggests there's considerable inertia in local authorities' decision making, barriers perhaps to changing their schemes, and the need to do consultation, reach agreement, and so on. But actually we think there's something more than inertia going on. For one thing, about half a dozen local authorities adopted minimum payments of 8.5% after any incentive to do so had already been removed. What's more, the remaining 8.5% minimum payments are found very much in geographical clusters of local authorities doing what their neighbours are doing. So you can see there's a group of them in Dorset. This is all around Derbyshire, Cambridgeshire and the East Anglia coast. 2 up there is Sunderland and Gateshead. Local authorities clearly are also attracted to doing what their neighbours are doing, keeping in line with them. So, having looked a bit at the schemes that local authorities have introduced, what are their overall effects on households? Well, there are 3.6 million households that we estimate would have been entitled to council tax benefit under the pre-2012 system. And on average, their entitlements are reduced by just under £200 a year, or 1% of their income. Now, of those 3.6 million households, 1.4 million are now getting a bill to pay that they simply wouldn't have had if council tax benefit was still in place. 1.6 million are seeing a bigger bill than they would otherwise have had. And those figures are pretty similar, only slightly smaller if we exclude the changes that are just mirroring cuts to national benefits. The remaining 500,000 households had no bill to pay under council tax, well, would have had no bill to pay under council tax benefit and still have no bill to pay. About 2/3 of those are because they live in local authorities with no minimum payments. The other third live in local authorities who do have minimum payments, but they are designated as part of a vulnerable group and protected from their local authority's minimum payment. And so if we focus in on the about 2 million households it is that wouldn't have had to pay anything under the old council tax benefit system, whose council tax would have been fully covered, I say about 500,000 of them, that's just over a quarter of these households, still have no liability under the 2018-19 system. That means the other 3/4 all have to pay something that they wouldn't have had to pay before. And that 63% have to pay more than £100, about 1 in 3 have to pay more than £200, and almost 1 in 10 who wouldn't have had to pay anything before and now having to pay more than £300 a year in council tax. And if we compare this to the distribution that was in place in the first year of localisation, from the schemes that local authorities initially introduced, we can see that there are considerable increases in the bills that households are having to pay. It wouldn't be an IFS event without a decile chart, so what I'm going to do here is line up all working age households in England from left to right and show you how much they lose from the cuts that are in place in 2018-19 relative to if no cuts had been made at all. And we can see both 2013-14 and 2018-19, the cuts are very much focused on low-income households, which of course is exactly what you'd expect because it was low-income households that were getting most of the support in the first place. And it turns out that the percentage reduction in support is roughly similar for all of the different income groups. Different income groups are having their support cut broadly in proportion to how much support they were getting in the first place. But that doesn't mean that every household or even each decile group is seeing the same proportional cut in support. For one thing, it varies a lot according to what local authority you're living in. As I've already shown you, things like minimum payments and other scheme characteristics vary a lot between local authorities. So what I'm going to do now is talk about what kinds of local authorities have made bigger and smaller cuts. And to start with, I'm just going to take the bottom two income groups that I've shown you there, take the poorest fifth of households, and say, well, what difference does it make whether you're a poor household in a poor local authority or a poor household in a richer local authority? And it turns out the more deprived local authorities were much more likely to introduce minimum payments. So if you're in the bottom fifth of the income distribution, living in a deprived local authority, or the most deprived fifth of local authorities, there's a 60% chance that you will have lost out from the reforms introduced. Whereas if you're in one of the least deprived fifth of local authorities, it's only about a 47-48% chance that you will have lost. Now that's not quite the end of the story though, because better, more affluent local authorities tend to have higher council tax rates. And so those people in the less deprived local authorities who are asked to pay some council tax are generally asked to pay more. So among those who do lose, the amount that they lose is actually bigger in less deprived local authorities. And these two effects broadly cancel each other out. Those in more deprived local authorities are more likely to lose, but lose less on average if they do lose. And so actually the pattern in terms of the average loss according to where you live looks broadly flat. So I've said that local authorities that were more deprived were more likely to make cuts to council tax support. It's also true that Labour-controlled councils were, and those that have seen bigger cuts in funding from central government, were also more likely to make cuts. The trouble is that those are often the same local authorities. And so the question is which of these characteristics or other characteristics that they may have is actually driving the size of cuts that they make. And what we do is we try to estimate the effect of each different characteristic of a local authority, so these three, for example, but also a whole bunch more that I won't list, the effect of each characteristic on council's choice of council tax support scheme, holding all of the others constant. We do that using regression analysis. There are more details of it in the report, but to jump straight to the results, what this tells us is that it is true that all else being equal, those local authorities that saw bigger reductions in funding from central government for council tax support in 2013-14 cut the generosity of their scheme by more. But once you control for that and other characteristics, actually the level of deprivation no longer looks like it has a significant effect. And in fact, Labour-run councils, far from being more likely to introduce minimum payments, once you take account of the other characteristics of the local authority, they're actually 15 percentage points less likely than Conservative-run councils to introduce minimum payments. Councils with no overall control were less likely to have made any changes, perhaps because of the difficulty of getting agreement. And district councils operating in two-tier areas with a county council above them, as it were also much less likely to make any change to their schemes. Finally, inner London local authorities will have shown themselves to be less likely to introduce big minimum payments. So let me return to the first of those that I just mentioned, the bigger reduction in council tax support funding leading to bigger cuts in council tax support itself. So those local authorities that saw bigger cuts to their funding from central government when council tax support was localised in 2013 have been significantly more likely to make cuts and have made bigger cuts in the generosity of their scheme. Now, after 2013-14, the grant that central government gave local authorities to pay for council tax support was no longer a separate labelled grant. It just got rolled into the overall funding grant that central government gave local authorities. And as we all know, the overall funding from central government to local authorities has been cut quite dramatically over the last 5 years. But what we see is that that funding cut to local authorities over subsequent years has turned out to make little difference to how much local authorities cut their schemes. Those local authorities that have seen bigger cuts to general funding from central government don't seem to have been any more likely, once you control for other characteristics, to pass those cuts onto households. Now, this is despite the fact that both when the grant was separately labelled in 2013 and when it's just got to come out of part of local authorities' general funding since then, councils have always been free to choose to spend as much as they want, more or less than that amount, on council tax support. And what this suggests to us is that the labelling of funding, and particularly the labelling of funding cuts as being in some sense for council tax support, has actually had an influence on how local authorities choose to spend that money. And presumably this might well carry over to other areas of policy. So let me sum up what I've told you so far. There have been big reductions to council tax support, both when it was first localised in 2013, but also going on since then. Overall, entitlement for working age households in England has been cut by almost a quarter. It's a cut of £200 a year or 1% of their income. There are almost 1.5 million households liable to pay council tax who previously wouldn't have had to pay it. Poor households are more likely to lose out if they live in poor areas, but those that lose don't tend to lose quite as much. And we've seen some interesting features of the way that local authorities seem to make their decisions about council tax support. We've seen a bunching of minimum payments at exactly 8.5% when the incentive to do that has long since disappeared. That suggests inertia, and we also saw some desire to align schemes with neighbouring local authorities. And we've seen that the labelling of funding grants from central government seems to have a significant effect on how local authorities choose to spend the money. So at this point I'll stop and hand over to Tom, who will talk about how households have responded to these cuts.
Thank you, Stuart. So Stuart's laid out what schemes local authorities have chosen and with what implications for households and in particular for household incomes. I'm going to think a bit about how households have actually responded to those reforms and what the wider impacts of those reforms have been. So in particular, I'm going to ask the question and try to answer, how have low-income households coped with this extra council tax that they have to pay as a result of these reforms? Do we see evidence that they've sought help and advice on paying their bill? Have they actually paid their additional council tax bills that are due? And do we see that households adjust over time? Do we see impacts when reforms are first introduced that then fade as households have time to get used to the new policy? And we're also going to be able to think about which types of household have had the most problems. Is it in particular, for example, those who wouldn't have had a bill to pay at all if council tax support cuts hadn't happened? So how are we going to work out what the effect of these different council tax support cuts are when lots of things have happened since 2013 in the economy? There have been lots of policy changes. Well, Stuart shows you that different local authorities have made very different decisions that mean that their schemes look very different. That's effectively lots of different local experiments going on around England. And that means that we can compare the outcomes in local authorities that did make a particular change with those that didn't. So formally, our basic approach is going to be difference in differences. Basically, what that means is that we're going to compare trends in local authorities that did make a particular scheme change with those that didn't, while also controlling for other factors, other features of that local authority that could lead those trends to diverge. So specifically, what we're assuming here is that if those council tax support cuts hadn't happened, if local authorities hadn't made different decisions, then the trends in outcomes in otherwise similar local authorities would have evolved similarly. So to be clear, we're allowing for the level of outcomes to be different. So for example, it's okay if local authorities that introduce minimum payments have lower collection rates than those that don't. All we require is that had those minimum payments not been introduced, that trends in collection rates would have evolved similarly in those different local authorities. Okay, so the first thing I'm going to look at is whether there's been a change in the number of queries to citizens' advice centres. So there are citizens' advice centres all over the country designed to help people with questions about debt, about bills, about many other things as well. And every time someone comes to a citizens' advice centre, they record some characteristics about that person, like their age, their local authority, and they also record what issues they've come to ask about. And very kindly, Citizens Advice have provided that database to us, and that's what we're going to be using here. So specifically, we're going to be looking at queries made by working age households that relate to council tax payment, to council tax debt, or to council tax support, and before that, council tax benefit. Now, I should note here that when I'm talking about trends in these queries, I'll be talking about all of them together. The most important one by far are council tax debt queries. So when you see me talking about the effects of these queries, you should be thinking predominantly about effects on council tax debt. To give you a sense of scale here, on average there are about 160 queries relating to council tax per local authority per quarter. That scales up to about 200,000 queries relating to council tax in England per year. Okay, so I'm now going to ask the question, what impact does introducing a minimum payment have on the volume of queries to citizens' advice? And I'm going to split this between three different levels of minimum payment, to small minimum payments of up to 8.5%, of slightly bigger minimum payments of up to 20%, and of large minimum payments of more than 20%. And in each case, I'll be comparing the effect of introducing a minimum payment of that level relative to not introducing one at all. So first, if we look at the small minimum payments, what this shows is that on average, local authorities introducing a minimum payment of that level, controlling for other factors, see a 20% increase in queries. And these black bars indicate a confidence interval, so we can be confident that this is a large effect. What about the effect of bigger minimum payments? Well, actually, we see that the level of minimum payment doesn't seem to be that important in determining the increase in relevant queries to citizens' advice, but we are seeing big increases of 15 to 20% of introducing a minimum payment at all. Now, you can think of these estimates as being averaged across the whole period of time that a local authority has had a minimum payment. But you might think that there is going to be bigger effects at the start and perhaps they fade over time. So what I'm now going to do is look at the effects separately by how many quarters it is since a local authority introduced a minimum payment. So we have data from 2013 running all the way up to 2018 Q3. Now what you can see is that the effects are are big and significant for the first 2.5 or 3 years, the first 10 quarters or so. After that, we do see some evidence of it tailing off. So that 6 years after a minimum payment's introduced, we don't see a difference in the number of queries between that minimum payment, between that local authority and a local authority that didn't introduce a minimum payment at all. But nonetheless, this represents a large increase in queries when minimum payments are introduced. Now that large increase in queries, and remember many of those queries are referring to council tax debt, suggests that there might have been considerable problems in households paying council tax, of course the flip side being that councils may have been unsuccessful in collecting the revenue. So what I'm now going to do is show you estimates of the share of the additional council tax, so the extra council tax that authorities have tried to collect because they've cut council tax support, so extra revenue to be collected from those CTS eligible households, and we're going to estimate what share of that has been uncollected versus successfully collected by local authorities. And if we look at all of the scheme choices, all of the cuts to council tax support, or if we only look at minimum payments only, we get a pretty similar answer, which is that around a quarter of this extra council tax has actually not been collected by local authorities. Is 25% a big number? How do we put that in context? Well, in 2012-13, on average, only 2.5% of council tax liabilities were uncollected. So that means that for these extra liabilities, this extra council tax, the rate of non-collection is about 10 times higher than this typical rate. But remember that this is only a relatively small amount of total council tax liabilities. So the total effect of these cuts is to increase the average non-collection rate from about 2.5% to about 2.7%. So a small effect in the overall collection rate, but this implies that much of the extra liabilities are not being collected, around 10 times less than typical council tax collection. So we saw that those citizens' advice queries seemed to tail off as local authorities had minimum payments for longer. Do we see the same effect here? So what I'm going to do now is present separate estimates on the share of council tax over the extra council tax collected based on how many years that local authority has had a minimum payment. And actually, if you look at the first year of a minimum payment, or the second or third year, or the fourth or fifth year, actually this estimate that around 25% of the extra revenue is not being collected is pretty robust, it's pretty consistent, it's remarkably stable across this period. So actually, we don't see any evidence here that the effect is tailing off. This does seem to be a long-lasting impact for local authorities. So local authorities not collecting council tax, the natural question that arises from that is which households are not paying, from which households are councils failing to collect this extra revenue. And to answer this question, I'm now going to turn to survey data, which is the same data that Stuart was using when he was showing the aggregate impacts of council tax support schemes. And this is going to allow us to answer different questions that we just couldn't answer with the local authority level data, like which types of households are most likely to go into arrears, and how much does the size of loss matter? Is it the case that households that lose a lot from council tax support cuts are much more likely to go into arrears than those that lose just a little, or does the pattern look different? Now, the strategy that we're using here is similar to before. Effectively, what we're doing is comparing two otherwise similar households who have different council tax support entitlement because they live in different authorities. And one local authority made cuts that the other didn't, and therefore they're being treated differently just because they live in a different place. And we're going to be comparing the trends in outcomes for them. Now, an important thing to note here about the data is that we're using self-reported council tax arrears, so whether a household says they're in council tax arrears. And based on the FRS, this survey, around 700,000 households in England report being in council tax arrears each year. Now, we know that this is a big underestimate. There are administrative sources out there that suggest that bailiffs were called on over 1 million households in 1 year relating to council tax debt, and presumably there were other instances of arrears where bailiffs weren't called. So this is an underestimate of the total number of households in arrears. There may be several reasons why households are underreporting this. Perhaps they're unwilling to divulge the information. Perhaps they're even unaware they're in arrears. Perhaps they've just not opened the letter. But either way, we've done a lot of digging here, and we're pretty confident that what we're showing here, this measure, does correlate with what you'd expect. But what I'm going to show you is going to be really informative about the patterns and trends. Which types of households are falling into arrears? How much does size of loss matter? But we shouldn't get too hung up on the precise magnitudes here, because we know there is some underreporting in the data. Okay, so the first thing I'm going to do is split households by their local authority, and split them again according to the size of minimum payment that their local authority introduces in 2013-14, the first year of localisation. I'm just going to look at those households that report receiving some council tax support. So firstly, let's focus on the rate of arrears for those households living in local authorities that don't introduce a minimum payment. You'll see that there's a bit of bumping around year on year, but actually this is pretty consistent over time. There's no clear trend over time. What if we look at those households living in authorities that introduced small minimum payments in 2013-14? Well, in the lead up to the reforms, before there was any minimum payment in place, their arrears looked pretty similar to the group in the authorities not introducing minimum payments. But after the reform, we see that these lines diverge, that there's a much higher level of arrears in the authority introducing small minimum payments than in the authority not introducing one at all. And we get similar effects if we look again at these larger levels of minimum payments. Nothing going on systematically before the reform happens, big increases in arrears afterwards. So clearly this is consistent with the collection rates that I showed you earlier. There's a big increase in arrears in those authorities with bigger minimum payments. But again, this is just sort of at the local authority level. It's not saying for a precise household how much you lose from council tax support matter. So what I'm now going to do is present estimates on the relationship between how much council tax support you lose as a result of reforms, that's the horizontal axis here, and the increase in the probability that you're in arrears. And so this is the profile that we see. So let me just take you through this slowly. So the first thing to notice over on the left side of the graph, that these are households that aren't losing very much from council tax support reforms at all, say £50 or so, it's about £1 a week. And yet they're much, much more likely to be in council tax arrears. And yet, if we go up to higher levels of loss from council tax support, actually those who are losing a lot more, say £250 or £300, are not that much more likely to go into arrears as a result of these cuts than those households that were losing just a little. And if we look at the overall implied effect of this, among those households losing in 2016-17, that's the most recent year of data that we have in the FRS, there's about a 54% increase in the rate of arrears. So we estimate that around 8.4% of them would have reported being in arrears, but in reality almost 13% do. So this is a pretty strange profile of loss relative to the probability of being in arrears. What's going on here? Well, one thing that can shed light on this is if we split households into different types. So in particular, what I'm going to do is divide households into whether, absent the reforms, so if the reforms hadn't have happened, would they have had some council tax to pay, or would they have had no bill at all? So this first set of households would have had some bill to pay anyway. So what the reforms are doing is giving these people a bigger bill, but not an entirely new one. And here we see very little effect on their probability of being in arrears. On the other hand, if we look at the set of households who would have had no bill to pay at all in the absence of the reform, you can see really big effects. And again, the same profile that I showed you on the previous graph, where what seems to matter is whether you lose a little, not how much you lose, which here means whether or not you have a bill to pay, have a new bill to pay, not the size of that bill per se. So that's the most important sort of distinction between different households in terms of understanding the effects, that they're being driven by those who, in the absence of the reforms, wouldn't have had a bill to pay at all. But we can also look at other household types that, when they're given a new bill, are more likely to go into arrears than other households. So what I'm going to show you here is that households with a new bill are more likely to go into arrears if they're lone parents. So lone parents are more likely to go into arrears when given a new bill than other household types, or if they're renting. And it's significant that these two groups are more adversely affected, more likely to go into arrears, because they're also the types of household that are more likely to have been given new bills. Lone parents are disproportionately reliant on council tax support, as are renters relative to lone parents. So they're more likely to have been given a new bill. And when they get that new bill, they're more likely to have gone into arrears. And we can also split this according to the type of local authority that households live in. And in particular, we can look at those households living in local authorities that had low collection rates in 2012 and those that had high collection rates in 2012, and compare two otherwise similar households who both have a new bill to pay. And we find that those living in the local authority that had low collection rates before 2013 were much more likely to go into arrears when given that new bill. So what's going on here? Well, it could suggest that the way that local authorities are collecting council tax is really important, that in some sense their collection efficiency matters. It could also imply peer effects. It could be that I'm much less likely to pay my council tax bill if my neighbour also isn't paying. Okay, so to summarise what I've shown you over the past 15 or 20 minutes. So we see clear evidence of substantial and long-lasting payment problems as a result of these reforms. We see more queries to citizens' advice in LAs with minimum payments. See that a quarter of the additional liabilities are going uncollected. And that's true even after the scheme's been in place for 5 years. And looking at the household level, at which households have been most likely to go into council tax arrears, we can see that the effects are driven by those who would have had no bill at all to pay in the absence of the reform, that the increase in arrears is likely to happen whether or not the new bill is big or small, and that we actually don't see an increase in arrears for those households that would have had to pay council tax anyway and just have to pay a bit more. And so bringing together everything that both Stuart and I have told you over the last 40 minutes or so, what lessons does this research provide for policymakers? How can this guide policy going forwards? Well, firstly, I think what Stuart shows you has some clear lessons for central government when devolving responsibilities and funding to lower levels of government. Firstly, that temporary incentives can have long-lasting impacts. 38 councils still have a minimum payment of 8.5%, 5 years after there was any incentive to have one. And secondly, that the way funding streams are labelled are likely to affect the ways in which it's spent. And that's something that central government should bear in mind when it's designing any devolution of funding. And then there are broader lessons for policymakers, both central and local, when designing policy for low-income households. We've seen that generating new bills for households to pay is much more likely to lead to non-payment than just increasing the size of existing bills, asking people who are already paying to pay a bit more. And even though that sounds like the kind of difficulty that you might expect to disappear as households adjust, we don't see that that's the case. We see that these difficulties don't disappear and that even 5 years later, much of the additional liabilities are not being collected. And this is important evidence both for local authorities in England and the Scottish and Welsh governments as they continue to grapple with designing their council tax support schemes. But there could also be some implications for other areas too, for example, housing benefit. Thank you.